when I was just over 7 years old. Due to some circumstances, I had a supernatural sensibility that was extremely strong for a period of time during my youth. However, this perceptiveness disappeared as I gradually grew up. My old house was near the mayor's mansion of Kaohsiung City, which is located in southern Taiwan, a 2-story townhouse. After so many years, that place has long since been rebuilt. According to my father, the area around my old house used to be fish ponds much earlier on. Thus, our old house was built after the fish ponds were filled in. Between our old house and the neighboring house, there was a narrow but very long and deep fire lane. The fire lane was very old, and from what I can remember, I've hardly ever seen anyone walk through there. The households on both sides of the fire lane tacitly locked the back doors leading to the fire lane. Once our back door was opened, it led directly to the fire lane. Strangely, my grandmother always stacked a pile of miscellaneous items at the back door. I lived there for 8 years and never once saw her open that door. Out of curiosity, I once asked her,
"Grandma, why is this door never opened?"
But she always avoided saying too much, just telling me, "No reason, just keep your distance." I said,
"Grandma, what's the reason? I want to open and have a look."
Angry, she said, "When I say no, I mean no. Why don't you listen?" Whenever we talked about the back door, my grandma always seemed to be unwilling to say much. For a 7 or 8-year-old child, the areas where adults strictly forbid them from going undeniably appear as mysterious realms with irresistible attraction. I was quite close with the older girl next door at that time, so I ran to ask her out of curiosity, Annie, did you know there's a fire lane behind our house?" Annie said, "I don't know. What about it?" I answered her in surprise.
"Really? Haven't you been there either? Every time I mention wanting to open the back door to take a look, my grandma would scold me fiercely. Why don't we go and explore together? What do you say?"
Annie replied, "Sure." So we chatted along the way. But when we got to the entrance of the fire lane, we found that it was locked as well. Through the gaps, we saw plenty of cats inside. At that moment, my supernatural radar suddenly became active. I felt a chill down my spine, goosebumps spreading all over my body. At that time, I was often disturbed by some strange things. So whenever I sensed something abnormal, I would get extremely scared. At the entrance of the fire lane, I inexplicably began to feel scared and decided to back down. Shivering, I said, Annie, let's go." The neighbor's older sister asked me with a puzzled look, "What's wrong?" I said quietly,
I feel scared. Let's go home. Hurry."
And so, our adventure in the fire lane ended right at the sealed entrance. Sometime later, I encountered a terrifying incident in my room on the first floor. As a child, I was scared to sleep alone, so I'd always go to sleep with my grandma. I slept and studied in that room. My grandma's room was on the ground floor, and there was a frosted glass window facing the firewall. I have a particularly vivid memory of one occasion because it was a day of torrential rain. The rain was heavy, like during a typhoon. It was super scary. Beyond the netted window, there's a welded iron window. On that night, I was reading with my desk facing the window. As I was reading, suddenly, a large black hand slammed directly onto the frosted glass. The entire hand was plastered on the glass, with the palm lines clearly visible. I was extremely confused. How did this hand manage to reach through the screen and the iron window to touch the glass? I was staring at the hand. It was really large, with a milky white palm and dark edges. It was raining heavily outside, and since the windows were closed, I couldn't see outside. However, my sixth sense told me that it belonged to a girl. At that moment, I just kept staring at the hand. Initially, it was only pressed against the glass, motionless. Suddenly, it began to hit the glass. Bang, 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 bang. The entire window vibrated from the pounding, as if it would shatter the next second. I was terrified and erupted in tears, for I knew it wasn't human. Sobbing uncontrollably, I ran to find my grandma and cried out, "Grandma, there's something outside my window." My grandma responded calmly, "What thing? Children shouldn't talk nonsense." Seeing that she didn't believe me, I kept trying to convince her. "It's true, Grandma. There's a hand outside my window." But no matter how much I tried, Grandma didn't believe me. She only told me to stop talking nonsense, scolded me, and told me to return to my room. When I got back to my room, the hand had disappeared. There were no traces of being hit on either the glass or the screen. I was terrified that night, but thankfully, the hand never returned. From that incident, I realized that if the frequency matches, spiritual entities can actually materialize and potentially harm people. But if it wasn't a ghost, think about it. A woman in the midst of a stormy night, standing inside a sealed fire lane, frantically pounding on a window. That's quite a surreal scene as well. Back when I used to stay at my grandmother's house, there was a mountain behind her home where a deity known as Ikemo-sama was worshipped. Given the lack of recreational areas around my grandmother's house, my grandfather and I often went fishing in a pond nearby the Ikemo-sama shrine. One day, when my grandparents went to town for shopping, I was left alone at home. As there was not much I could do, I decided to go fishing by myself. Typically, when I went to the pond with my grandfather, we used to take a long detour. But since I was alone that day, I chose a shortcut. This shortcut was sort of like the hiding place of Mei in Miyazaki Hayao's animation Totoro, just enough for one person to pass through, though my grandparents always told me not to take this shortcut without giving any reason. Being a headstrong kid, I didn't pay much heed. The entrance was circumscribed by artfully arranged stones, but disregarding this, I stepped in. After walking for a few minutes, I reached the pond and started fishing. About an hour later, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted a figure in distance. Simultaneously, I felt as though I heard someone calling out, "Akiyoel, Akiyoel." Given that this area was usually deserted, I felt a bit uneasy. However, when I investigated, I didn't see anything and concluded it must have been an illusion. Just as I was about to go back to fishing, I saw my grandpa's truck coming hurriedly towards me. I assumed he was there to pick me up, so I packed up my gear. But upon seeing the serious look on his face, I understood something wasn't right. Without saying a word, he pulled me into the truck, leaving behind my fishing rod and beloved water bottle. Once in the vehicle, I was covered with some sort of white cloth and strictly ordered not to lift it. The entire way home, my grandfather remained silent, muttering indistinct phrases. When we got home, he donned the white cloth that had been covering me, and my grandmother quickly replaced it with a new one. Accidentally, I noticed the gathered neighbors and the entire house draped in white cloth, leaving me baffled. Now, when I reflect, I presume the white cloths were prepared for an emergency like this. After all this, my grandmother commanded me to take a bath. I was led to a slightly larger room where an unfamiliar elderly man was present. He questioned me about where I had been, how long it took, and everything else. Then, he explained to me about Ikemo-sama. It was revered as the deity protecting the pond. However, since Ikemo-sama was still young and prone to loneliness, a child used to be sacrificially offered to the deity by the village in the past. These children would notably take the same shortcut that I did to reach the deity's dwelling. However, the era of live sacrifices had come to an end. Hence, whenever Ikemo-sama felt lonely, it would descend to the village and take away a child. To keep the child by its side always, it would sever their Achilles tendon, preventing them from escaping. To stop Ikemo-sama from coming out, the villagers arranged stones to seal the path. Initially, I took this as a grim joke, but everything changed when I looked at my own foot, utterly immobile with shock. My calf was sliced open, bleeding yet painless. Suddenly, the elderly man shouted, and I was surrounded by folks clad in white cloths. My grandmother performed some kind of unfamiliar ritual to stem the bleeding. I was told my condition was dangerous, and my grandfather decided to rush me home. I was loaded onto a light truck draped in the same white cloth, apparently because Ikemo-sama couldn't see white. Despite this, my calf was cut inside the house, probably because it wasn't completely covered. No incidents happened on our way back, which lightened my anxiety, and I let down my guard. The stuffy environment beneath the cloth led me to open the car window, and that's when the unsettling happened. I clearly heard a voice calling, "Kiyoe, Kiyoe." At that instant, I blacked out and woke up at my grandmother's house. After sharing this with her, she said it was all merely a dream. However, my water bottle and fishing equipment were missing, and no one believed my story despite the scar that lingered on my right leg. Even after several years, the wound looks fresh. My wife and I started a business together. Over the past 8 years, we jointly ran a security equipment company. Just as the company had passed a major refinancing review by a local bank and was growing steadily profitable, my wife, who served as the executive director, died unexpectedly. Since then, I had lost interest in the business. Although I knew it was wrong, I left work unattended and spent my days cooped up in front of my wife's picture, becoming a typical waste of space. Naturally, the business couldn't proceed as planned, and the bank stopped lending, leaving the company unattended for a whole month without leaving the house. By the time I regained my sanity and recovered a little from my grief, the business had already reached a point of no return. I couldn't repay the financing I had obtained to this day. I was thinking, well, just give up. I walked scruffily into a hardware store with a beard of a month's growth, bought the thickest rope, and tied it to the ceiling fan when I got home. I stood on the chair. It wasn't as terrifying as I thought. All I had to do was kick the chair over, and and everything would end immediately. But I was just daydreaming, thinking that the knowledge of a life flashing before your eyes, or having a revelation at the last moment, was all fabricated. Just as I was thinking it was about time, I took a glance at the chair beneath my feet. I noticed something in front of it. That thing, with greasy long hair hanging down, bloodshot eyes peeping out between the hair, and a grinning mouth that made one nauseated. It was looking at the chair I was standing on, and I distinctly felt it hoping for me to hurry up and fall. Without thinking, I stared at it. It seemed to notice my gaze too, and met my eyes. It also looked a bit startled. Its mouth corners drew down slightly, but soon restored its creepy grin and said, in a middle-aged man's voice,
"If you're going to die, can I have your child?"
Before I even had time to figure things out, I reflexively said, "I'm not going to die." Only after saying that did I realize how terrifying the thing I was doing was. I have a 5-year-old daughter. Since my wife's death, I have neglected her and dumped her on my wife's family for care. It's been a month since I've thought about this. I immediately untied the noose, got off the chair. The creature from earlier had disappeared, but I could still feel its presence in the atmosphere. I went straight to my wife's family's house to apologize and cry, holding my daughter. Both my daughter and my in-laws forgave me in tears. I'm now a salesman, paying back the debt and raising my daughter and struggling to stay alive. I don't know what would have happened if I had died then, but I have a feeling that the inexplicable creature really did exist, hiding somewhere, yearning for me and my daughter. This happened in April of last year. After our club activity ended, we would tell ghost stories in the club room to pass the time while waiting for the bus. This had become our routine. Although it was telling ghost stories, most of the stories we told were actually jokes that would make you laugh at the end. In addition, to keep our advisor from finding out, we would always turn off the lights and block the door with the speakers. That day, the members present were me and 2 senior students who were a year ahead of me. It was very bright outside the room that day, and everyone was not in the mood. Just as we were saying we should go to the bus stop now, we heard a knock on the door. Thinking it was the advisor, the 3 of us held our breath, but the voice outside the door turned out to be Kay, who graduated last year.
"Why is the door closed? Open it."
Kay is a prankster, so he probably just came to play without notifying us. While I was about to move the speakers, I was stopped by one of the seniors. That senior was a member of the same band as Kay. Kay had important matters at the university today, and even canceled the band practice. It's impossible for him to be here now. As he said this, I suddenly froze. However, the voice outside the door was indeed Kay, and even the senior looked incredulous. At this time, the entity sounding like Kay continued to knock on the door.
"Hey, why don't you open the door? This is so mean. Don't do this. No, it's not right. You want me to cry for you guys to see. I'm going to sing. Can I sing Jingle Bells?"
Singing Jingle Bells is a running joke of Kay's, and the wording and voice were all indeed Kay's. However, for some reason, it made us feel uncomfortable and feel that it wasn't Kay. If he suddenly went mad, shouting in a completely different tone, "Ah, ah, ah," it would have been easier for us. Precisely because it is identical to the usual Kay, it creates an atmosphere that makes it impossible to open the door. Unable to sit still, we called Kay.
Kay, where are you now?
Hello? What's wrong? I'm at the university.
The moment he said this, the voice and the knock on the door stopped at the same time. We instantly became scared, and all of us escaped through the window. The call was hung up during our run, and Kay called back out of concern.
What's wrong with you? When you called just now, there was a terribly eerie noise in the background. What was that?
It seems that the voice only sounded like Kay in our ears. After this incident, nothing happened to us and Kay. I still get scared of the club room to this day. In our family, there are 3 sisters, and as the eldest sister, I have a particularly close relationship with the youngest sister. Over time, the bond between our children also became deep. My younger sister was the first among us to get married. Regrettably, she suffered an unfortunate miscarriage 2 years ago due to poor fetal development. After that, we almost simultaneously welcomed our own children. However, my sister's child was physically weaker and smaller in size compared to other children of the same age. When the children were around 2 to 3 years old, a series of peculiar events started to occur. My sister often dreamt about children she did not recognize playing with our children. Her daughter, who was skinnier and weaker compared to girls her age, often fell over, so we initially thought she had developmental delay and even had her checked. But then, one day, while she was holding her daughter on her lap while using her phone, she suddenly felt a push, and her child mysteriously fell to the ground. Once the child got up, she casually said,
Mom, you hold it.
and then went to the living room to play. Later, during a family trip to Alishan, my sister's child suddenly had an asthma attack. An elderly forest ranger insisted we immediately descend the mountain, stating that our aura was not good. That night, in the hospital, my sister's daughter was put on a children's oxygen mask. Strangely enough, the child's blood oxygen level was normal when the lights were on. But as soon as the lights were switched off, her blood oxygen level would plummet, causing my sister to lose sleep. They were unable to finish their week-long trip as planned, so they decided to return to Wanhua to meet with my daughter. That night, at 3 a.m., a pizza machine toy in the children's toy area suddenly started to sing, "I like pizza. I like cooking." This scared me. The next day, I thoroughly inspected all toy sound settings, but that night, the same toy started singing the pizza song again. This time, my daughter was awakened, her cry shrill. On the 3rd night, the pizza machine sang again, and the child's cry was even louder and more distressing. She was pointing to the toy area and kept repeating, "There, there." The next day, we decided to take the children to the temple for a prayer and discarded the pizza machine toy. My sister also sent me a photo of them at the Alishan rest station. The sunlight in the photo was bright but overly dazzling that their faces became blurred in the photo. It had a penetrating feel to it. They also went to pray and consulted the deity and learned that an unborn child was following them, but there was no malicious intent, and my daughter's crying at night was simply because she wanted to play with the toy. Not long after, a colleague told me that he had a toy to give to our daughter, and the next day, he brought exactly the same pizza machine toy. I don't know whether this is a coincidence or... Anyhow, it was an unsettling experience for my sister and me. This is an experience I had after the freshman orientation camp in my first year at college in Taiwan. During the night exploration activity, I was always leading and showing no fear, as I knew that this was a series of scary events designed by the seniors. Therefore, when we set off that evening, I was at the front of the team, full of enthusiasm, and even easily solved the challenges set by the seniors, leading my team to pass smoothly. I thought, is this night exploration so unchallenging? Is this supposed to scare me? Just as we were crossing the intersection of a field and a forest, next to a rather deep drainage ditch, a senior dressed as a ghost jumped out to scare us. As the first person in the team, I was startled and started screaming. It was the moment I truly felt terrified. Just like what people say, I felt like I was scared out of my wits. At that moment, I really thought I had experienced so-called soul startling. After that, we finished the night exploration, and the next day's welcoming activities ended smoothly. There were no other anomalies or discomfort. About 1 or 2 weeks after the orientation camp ended, I spent the weekend with my father, who teaches in Taiwan City in Taiwan. That night, we each slept in different rooms. I was in the smaller room, and my father was in the master bedroom. On Saturday night, I fell asleep quickly, but in the middle of the night, I suddenly woke up feeling like something was destined to happen. It was then that I noticed, out of the corner of my eye, a white shadow appeared in the corner of the room. This white shadow was very large, almost extending from the floor to the ceiling. I couldn't determine what it was. Fortunately, it did not have specific hands, legs, or facial contours. This might be what I was thankful for. But I could feel it just looking at me as I was at it. My neck kept breaking out in cold sweat, and I dared not move a muscle. As I was considering what to do, the white shadow actually tilted towards me, slowly, like Michael Jackson's dance move, leaning forward at a 45-degree angle. Right then, courage surged from somewhere within me. I stretched out my left leg, trying to stop it from tilting further. Right when it was around 30 degrees from me, it stopped. It was good it didn't have any concrete features. Else I would have been completely petrified. Then, it slowly drifted from my left side to the back of my right head, until it slowly left my field of vision, disappeared. I was stiffened in bed, full of doubts in my mind. What on earth was that? Did I really see all this with my eyes wide open? Or was it just a dream? But I was sure I was awake. Finally, I lay there without daring to move for about half an hour, and made sure everything was okay before I forced myself to get up and run to my father's room to tell him what had happened. The next morning, I told my mother, who was on her way up north, over the phone about everything. She instantly took clothes from our Taichung home to a local temple to get enchantments and blessings, then brought them to me. I wore the blessed clothes and drank the enchanted water. Thus, the incident came to an end. Looking back, I linked my experience at the orientation camp to what happened that night, feeling that I might have truly been frightened that night. Perhaps that panic state attracted something bad. But luckily, that thing did not truly harm me, and I did not feel any malicious intent from it. This is a story of my own experience. This happened when I was around 4 or 5 years old. At that time, there was no bathroom at home, so I often went to the public bathhouse with my mother. One day, after taking a bath, I started to feel bored, and I began to play in the bath pool as if it were a swimming pool. I suddenly noticed a staircase and a door beside the bath pool. Below the door handle, there was a large keyhole. Filled with anticipation, I peered inside, but something was blocking the other side, and I couldn't see anything. Maybe there's nothing special, I thought to myself. But curiosity drove me to press my eye against the keyhole again. In the dim light, I vaguely saw a machine like a boiler. Wow, how fascinating. I stared intently through the keyhole, totally captivated. Whether it was sensing the atmosphere behind the door or some kind of intuition, I suddenly moved my gaze away from the keyhole and instinctively took a step back. The next moment, a sharp, flathead screwdriver thrust out from the keyhole, shaking vigorously. I held my breath and quickly left the spot. I was so scared that I couldn't even tell my mother about it. This experience left an indelible mark on my heart, and every time I recall it, it sends shivers down my spine. During my days in Hiroshima, I encountered quite a few eerie events, but one in particular is especially unforgettable. It was on a sunny afternoon, the day of my elementary school sports meet. My parents came to watch me participate in the event, but went home after lunch. The sports meet ended around 5 p.m., and feeling exhausted, I hurried back home right afterward. When I got home, everything was silent, and there was no one around, so I went straight to bed to rest. I don't know how much time had passed, but the buzzing sound of a hairdryer woke me up from my sleep. I rubbed my eyes and walked towards the source of the sound, the bathroom. There, I saw my mother drying her hair. We chatted casually for a bit, and at that moment, I heard my father's voice from the living room.
Let's go out for dinner tonight.
I replied, I'm not hungry, still want to sleep. With that, I went back to my room to continue sleeping, vaguely remembering that my mother let out a faint sigh as I left. Later, I woke up around midnight with my stomach growling. I decided to head to the living room to find something to eat. On my way, I once again heard the sound of the hairdryer coming from the bathroom. The same scene replayed, my mother drying her hair. Several hours had passed, so I couldn't help but ask, Mom, how long are you going to dry your hair? Her response stunned me.
As long as I want. Do you want me to kill you?
I vaguely remember her saying something else, but at that moment, her eyes were completely red, as if bloodshot. I was terrified and hurriedly ran towards the living room where I thought I heard my family talking. To my surprise, the living room was pitch black. There was no one there at all. I noticed a letter on the table. I can't remember the full content, but it roughly said, "Welcome home. We're sorry we could only accompany you in the morning. We had to go out for some errands. I've prepared snacks and dinner in the kitchen. If you're hungry, help yourself. Reading this letter in the dark living room, I felt a chill run down my spine and was absolutely terrified. Just when I didn't know what to do, my parents returned home, and I ran crying into my mother's arms, too scared to say anything. This happened 3 years ago in the summer when I was running in the mountains of Gifu Prefecture. It had been a sunny day, but suddenly it started pouring rain. I accidentally discovered a place ahead that looked like a parking lot or a rest area, so I decided to go over and take a break. There was a parking lot, restrooms, and something like a rest area with a wooden roof, tables, and benches. I parked my car and went to use the restroom. When I came out, the rain had intensified, and it even started thundering loudly. I stared at the sky, unsure of when the rain would stop, and decided to put on my raincoat and check the surroundings. I placed my luggage on the table, took out my raincoat, and suddenly noticed an elderly couple sitting on the bench. Just a moment ago, there was no one here. When did they arrive? I thought to myself, feeling puzzled. But what was more important to me was when the rain would stop. After changing into my raincoat, I looked at the sky for another 5 minutes or so. During this time, the elderly couple didn't say a word, which made me feel uneasy and a bit strange, so I decided to start a conversation with them.
It suddenly started raining, didn't it?
Upon hearing me speak, the elderly couple exchanged a glance, and the old man said,
It has always been raining.
I found it odd. What do you mean? It just started raining. To avoid more interaction with them, I looked at the sky and responded, I came by bike. If the rain doesn't stop, I won't be able to go back. After a 2-second pause, the old man said, Is that so? How pitiful. You can't go back. I was taken aback upon hearing that. What does that even mean? I suddenly turned my head to look at the elderly couple. They had vanished without a trace. I muttered to myself, those two seemed suspicious. I didn't think much of it afterwards, and as I was about to leave, I suddenly heard an angry shout from afar. At that moment, I lost consciousness, and when I opened my eyes, a man in his 30s was shaking my shoulders, saying, Are you okay? Are you okay? He said that he saw me coming out of the restroom, climbing over the fence as if I was about to jump, and rushed over to stop me. Checking the time, I realized I had fainted for about 2 minutes. It was raining heavily just now, but it has already stopped, I said. The man, however, replied, It didn't rain at all. I was still wearing my raincoat, and there were no signs of rain on the road, but my raincoat was completely soaked. When I was little, I was an extremely slow eater, the kind who could take 2-3 hours to finish a meal. Once, because I was eating too slowly, my mom actually left with my younger siblings without me. It was the first time I was left alone at home. I was quite scared and panicked at first. Fortunately, it was only around noon, and there was still sunlight. So, after panicking for a while, I calmed down. The usually noisy house suddenly became very quiet. I chose to sleep to pass the time until they returned. When I opened my eyes again, it was already dark. It was around 6 p.m., and because it was winter, the sun had set earlier. I got up to use the bathroom. Our bathroom has a small ventilation window that faces the backyard, where we have a wooden tool shed. When I was halfway through using the bathroom, I suddenly heard rustling leaves.
Huh? Is someone walking in the backyard?
At first, I thought I had misheard, so I kept staring at the ventilation window. The rustling sound continued and seemed to be getting closer to me. There's someone in the backyard. At night, I should be the only one in the house. So who's in the yard? Could it be a burglar? I thought. The bathroom light was on, so that person must know I'm home. Just as I was wondering what to do, the rustling sound stopped. Suddenly, there was a plop sound. A face appeared outside the window, but it wasn't a human face. The face was purple and hairy, and occupying half of its face was a pair of large yellow eyes with red pupils. It had its hands on the window edge, looking at me with those eyes. Then it revealed more of its lower face. My God, it was grinning at me, its mouth stretching almost from its right ear to its left ear, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth. I came to my senses and screamed in fear, while that thing was trying to climb in. Suddenly, click. It was the sound of our front door opening. My mom and the others were back. I quickly rushed out and hugged them, crying continuously. My dad thought someone had broken in, so he immediately ran to the backyard to check. But there was no one there. That strange thing had simply vanished. To this day, I'm still not sure what exactly I saw. This is a true horror story that happened in Taiwan. When I was 19, my father was diagnosed with cancer. We started trying many methods, hoping to find a glimmer of hope among them. We tried traditional Chinese medicine, Western medicine, and even folk remedies. We even tried spiritual healing, although most of it felt fake. Later, through a friend's introduction, we met a psychic. With just my father's date of birth and other related information, he was able to predict my father's life events, such as when he started working, got married, gained wealth, and had children. He also accurately described family relationships, work life, and other details. The precision of his predictions made us believe him. I remember initially thinking he was a fraud. I went 3 times to see how accurate he really was. The first visit was very strange. Just as we were about to reach the destination, I suddenly fell asleep in the car. One moment, I was chatting and laughing, and the next moment, I was silent. My mother noticed I was asleep and couldn't wake me up, no matter how hard she tried. I'm usually a light sleeper, but that time I slept deeply. My mother said that when we arrived, I even sat up and said,
I don't want to go.
Then fell back asleep. They had no choice but to leave me in the car. That day's memory is very peculiar, as if someone erased it from my mind. I only remember that we were supposed to visit a psychic, but never went. A few months later, I asked my mother, when are we going to see that psychic? She told me we had already been there. A few months later, my father and the others went back to see the psychic. This time, I made sure I didn't fall asleep and finally met him. The psychic said to me,
If it's not your concern, you can't come. Today, it is your concern.
I didn't understand at the time and thought he was just pretending to be mysterious. The psychic asked for my birth date, lit a few incense sticks, and started talking to an empty chair next to him. I was skeptical. He said we had to wait for an answer and chatted with us over tea. Finally, we got the answer. It turned out that my parents and I had been family for several lifetimes. In one lifetime, my father in this life was a woman, and my mother in this life was a man. Their genders were reversed. My mother was surprised because she always thought my father had a feminine personality, like loving to shop, go out, take photos, and dress up. My mother, on the other hand, rarely wore makeup, disliked going out, and had a personality like an old man. She often joked that my father was more suited to be a woman. The psychic told us that in that lifetime, my father had to go on a business trip, and the roof of the house was leaking. He instructed my mother, who was my father in this life, to hire workers to fix it. My mother did as told, but during the rainy season, the house couldn't be fixed. She forced the workers to work overtime to finish before her husband returned. As a result, a worker fell from the roof and died. In this life, the worker came to take my father's life, and my mother would lose an eye as a price. Later, my mother did lose an eye suddenly one day. My father's illness improved significantly after the psychic's intervention, which even the doctors found incredible. 5 years later, when we thought my father had recovered, the psychic called and said something bad had happened related to my father. We rushed back, and the psychic revealed a second karmic connection. He said that my parents and I had been family for several lifetimes. In another lifetime, I was still their son, and their genders were reversed. My parents found me a suitable marriage partner, but I already had someone I loved named Mila. My mother, who was my father in this life, strongly opposed it. We thought that if we had a child, our parents wouldn't stop us. However, even after we had a child, my mother didn't approve and secretly hired someone to get rid of the child. Mila died from an infection. It was said to be very bloody and tragic. Mila held a grudge and wanted our lives. After several lifetimes, she couldn't find us until this life. The psychic said I looked very similar to my past life, so she found me. He advised us to eat vegetarian, recite scriptures, and copy sutras to resolve the issue. One day, while I was napping in my college dorm around 5 p.m., I heard a faint female laugh near my left ear. I looked around the room, but it was quiet, and my roommates were not there. Suddenly, I heard a sound like someone throwing trash into the bin. I was so scared that I put on my clothes and ran out of the dorm. Later, the psychic said Mila was willing to let me go, but not my father. She felt her death was too unjust, and her child was innocent. The psychic couldn't do anything because she had divine permission for revenge. My father survived the first calamity, but 5 years later, his cancer returned, and he passed away shortly after. This happened 3 years ago when I returned to my hometown. Near my old home, there is a rather steep slope about 100 meters long. On both sides of the road are earthen embankments, with stone walls about 1 meter high to prevent people from falling. It was just around sunset, and the surroundings were getting slightly dark. Since it was this time of day, and my hometown is in the countryside, there were no other pedestrians besides me. Then, I saw a long-haired woman standing at the top of the slope, with her back facing me. Although she was just standing there, I couldn't take my eyes off her. Even as I got close enough to recognize that she was wearing a faded, light pink suit, I continued to stare at her back. She remained motionless, with only her hair fluttering in the wind. When I got about 10 meters away and was about to look away, the woman's neck suddenly bent backward 180 degrees. I was startled and took a step back. Although I didn't see her expression, maybe it was better that I didn't. The woman was still facing away from me, but her face was now turned towards me, and she started walking towards me step by step. I turned around and started running. Since it was downhill, she walked quickly, and I thought I could escape. But halfway down, I realized she was catching up to me. Sure enough, I heard her footsteps. Clack, 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 as she caught up to me and then past me. As she passed me, goosebumps rose on my arms and cheeks. Even so, I stopped to catch my breath and then held it. The woman was standing at the bottom of the slope, just like before, with her back to me. Her neck had returned to normal. I slowly approached a few steps, and sure enough, as I expected, her neck bent backward again, and she started walking towards me. I thought this was no joke, and turned around to run up the slope this time. Since it was uphill, I was slower than before, and I thought, this is bad. I'll be easily caught. But this time, she didn't immediately chase after me, although I could always hear her footsteps right behind me. When I was about 10 meters from the top of the slope, I thought I was safe this time and could reach the exit. At that moment, the woman passed me again. Looking up, sure enough, she was waiting at the top with her back to me. Helplessly, I turned around and ran down the slope again. After running back and forth twice, I was exhausted and decided to try another method. I climbed over the wall and jumped onto the earthen embankment beside it. In hindsight, maybe I should have done this from the beginning. I cautiously looked up, and the woman was gone. But I still didn't want to return to the road, so I walked home along the embankment. Even now, I still feel a bit scared of that slope. This is a true story that happened a few summers ago in the apartment where I used to live. That day, I was very tired from my part-time job, so I fell into a deep sleep as soon as my head hit the pillow. I remember it was around 3:30 a.m. when I was awakened by a strange sound. The sound was like the mailbox at the door being opened. Creak, creak. I thought to myself, it's too early for the newspaper to be delivered, right? Because I was so tired, I tried to ignore the sound and go back to sleep. However, the sound didn't stop. As the sound continued, I felt uneasy and sat up to look towards the entrance. The room was pitch black, and my eyes hadn't adjusted to the darkness yet. I squinted towards the entrance and saw something moving near the mailbox. A chill ran down my spine, and I decided to get up and walk towards the entrance, where the creak, creak sound was coming from. When I saw the scene at the entrance, I was stunned. A pale blue hand was reaching out from the mailbox, continuously moving the door handle up and down. I stood there in terror, unable to move. The pale blue hand started to bend at impossible angles, reaching for the lock on the door handle, trying to open it. I was terrified and grabbed an umbrella that was leaning nearby, stabbing it towards the hand. I could feel the umbrella piercing into the flesh, but it didn't stop me. Driven by fear, I continued to stab. The hand suddenly retracted, and the sound stopped. I looked through the peephole, but there was no one outside. I thought to myself, is this a ghost? That night, I wrapped myself in a blanket and trembled as I fell asleep. The next evening, I woke up and prepared to go to work. Nervously, I walked towards the entrance and found numerous small round marks on the door. Those were the marks left by the umbrella when I stabbed the pale blue hand. I was sure I only hit the hand and didn't hear metal being struck, nor did I feel it. But the strange things didn't stop there. There were clear footprints outside, facing the entrance, full of mud. It hadn't rained that day or the day before, and there was no mud on the stairs. 2 weeks later, I moved to my current apartment. To this day, I still have nightmares about that night and wake up in a fright. Was it a ghost or a stalker? It was really terrifying at the time. If you want to see my videos faster, please like and subscribe to my channel and press the bell icon to get new video updates.